Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is that you happen to be watching this. We are glad that you have chosen to tune in to Coral Ridge's Sunday School. This will be the last Sunday School of the year, 2000, and we'll be starting Sunday School again when the new year starts. So you'll have a couple of weeks in which there won't be any Sunday School, either from myself or from my friend David. Today, since we're thinking about the times in between the Testaments, I wanted for us to think about some important religious groups. That is, some groups of people some of which are mentioned in the New Testament and some of which aren't mentioned in the New Testament. And I'd like for us to just think about them and what kind of a difference they made in terms of what was going on during the time of Jesus. So, in terms of overall observations, there are a few things that we should recognize. One is that you should speak about Judaisms rather than Judaism. There was no such thing during this time as a common Jewish viewpoint, just as there is no such thing today as a common American viewpoint or even a common evangelical viewpoint. It depends upon whom you ask. Is there an orthodoxy? Well, not exactly. Even evangelicals would differ on exactly what orthodoxy is. A second thing to recognize is that most Jews did not identify with any of the parties. That is, that most Jewish people simply didn't. They were none of these things that we will talk about today. They were simply Jewish, and that was it. Thirdly, a lot of textbooks, most might be an overstatement, but a lot of textbooks give us a far clearer view than our sources really allow. The truth is that the material is sketchy. We read about them in the New Testament. We read about them in Josephus. We read about them in rabbinic materials. But it's not like we have a ton of written material to which we can turn. And fourthly, there's a methodology of approach, and that is, should we, for example, accept the rabbinic material? The rabbinic material is late, sometimes 300 AD, sometimes 500 AD, depending upon what you're checking. And as a result of that, sometimes that stuff is so late that we can't really read it back into what was Second Temple Judaism. So let's look at just a few of these different kinds of groups together. First of all, there are the Sadducees. You've all, I'm sure, heard of the Sadducees. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are pretty much the famous enemies of Jesus in the Gospels. And we should make sure that we realize that the Sadducees and the Pharisees that are represented in the Gospels may not be exactly what other Pharisees were. That is, they may be some sort of a very strange group that were different, just as perhaps fundamentalism is different from evangelicalism, and yet we would all call ourselves Christians. So let's first of all talk about some background. They reigned during the time of Hyrcanus I, but they existed during the time even when Jesus was there. There's a great deal of discussion about what the name means and where it came from. There are some who argue that this came from a high priest named Zendox, and those who followed him were Zendoxes, which eventually became Sadducees. Others argue that it came from the Greek syndiko, which means members of a council. The truth is, we don't know exactly why they were called the Sadducees. And of all the groups, it's the Sadducees that we know the least about. We don't have one single source from their own hand, unless you want to count Josephus and the Apostle Paul. The problem, of course, is that both the Apostle Paul and Josephus no longer considered themselves a Sadducee. And as a result of that, we don't have any real Sadducee who's writing from the position of saying, I'm a Sadducee, I believe in Sadducees, and this is what we hold to. We have it being written about, even if it were people who were former Sadducees, they are now an enemy of this group. What is it that the Sadducees believed in? Well, there are a variety of things that we know from the New Testament. First, in both Josephus and in the New Testament, we learn that they did not believe in the resurrection. They thought that the resurrection was a foolish belief and that it was not in any sense taught in the New Testament. And you can look at these passages together and you will find that very thing there. A second thing is that they didn't believe in angels, particularly the kind of angelic intervention that you see in the New Testament. The Sadducees were not, and there are a lot of groups in the Second Temple period that had a lot of stories about angels. The Sadducees simply thought that this was some sort of story, and that there weren't really any of these angels that were doing anything like what the New Testament said that they were doing. And so as a result of that, they didn't have any belief in those sorts of angels. We see a lot of angels, as I said. If you look in the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scroll materials, or other written materials, you will have a lot of talk about angels. But the Sadducees denied that, and so they just don't. Two of the very firmest beliefs that we have in the New Testament, that is the resurrection and the intervention of angels, don't exist in Sadduceeism. Thirdly, they were conservative. They resisted theological innovations. They did not want things to change. You can see Josephus for some of this, and just look for Sadducees in Josephus. Some argue that they believed only in the Pentateuch. This has been found incorrect, although 50 or 75 years ago you would find that written. They did, though, not just believing in the Pentateuch, they didn't believe in the oral law in the same way the Pharisees did. And so they must have emerged after the revolt that we talked about last week, the Hasmonean revolt. They must have emerged during that time as those who were willing to go along with the Hasmoneans. And so that's essentially a little bit about the Pharisees, what you see about them in the New Testament and outside the New Testament. The second major group are the Pharisees. Again, this is a group that you have heard about many times in the New Testament, both from the Gospels and from the Apostle Paul. And they have gotten a lot of attention, a lot of scholarly attention over the last 30 to 40 years. Some of this is because they appear to be the chief antagonists of the Lord Jesus and the chief antagonists of the Apostle Paul. And this has given rise to a great deal of discussion about why they were opposed to Jesus and what exactly they were opposed to, or why Jesus was opposed to them. Why could Paul still call himself a Pharisee? There's a sense in which Paul says, I am a Pharisee of the Pharisees, indicating that there's some way in which he can still call himself a Pharisee. And these questions are driven by the questions about the nature of the intertestamental Jewish religion, or the Second Temple Jewish religion. There has been a tendency to see the intertestamental period only through the New Testament, and that has been widely seen in the last 40 years or a little less as a mistake, as a problem. And so this view that we should only see the Pharisees as they are presented in the New Testament has been challenged by Sanders, by Dunn, by a variety of others. The Pharisees are usually seen as those who hate Christ, but we should recognize, in terms of their background, that we've got to somehow get to the idea of why it is, what it is that they hate about Christ, and that will help us. The name Pharisee, Josephus mentions that there are all things that he studied. led him to a great deal of study on the Pharisees. And so he does not suggest that they came to be at this point, but that they were already there. So the name itself is this matter of debate. Some have seen them as expounders in one language, or from prish, separators. We don't know. The name has been used as a derogatory term, and that may be why the rabbinic material never uses the term. There's no sense in which the rabbinic material says this comes through the Pharisees, even though we believe that it does. The sources in which we study about the Pharisees comes to us really, there's a lack of evidence from the mouth of the Pharisees. We have Josephus, who claims to have investigated them and become one. And the problem is that he doesn't like the Pharisees. And so the problem is one of bias, just as we talked about the Sadducees a few moments ago. So you cannot simply trust Josephus. There are times when he allows his biases to get away from him. A second source is the New Testament. And there are two problems with the New Testament. One is methodological. That is, simply because we see the problems of certain Pharisees in the New Testament doesn't mean that those are the problems of the Pharisees everywhere. Just because the Pharisees in the New Testament seem to hate Jesus and have a problem with pride doesn't necessarily mean that all Pharisees had that. And so we should be careful in thinking that the New Testament gives us an absolute, total, and complete view of what the Pharisees were during that time, because it doesn't. We know a little bit more about what the Pharisees taught, and that is they attempted to control essentially all of life. And they were concerned about bringing everything in life under the sovereignty of God. They seem to have been sort of theological innovators. They developed the Torah. They developed eschatology. They developed, at least they attempted to apply the priestly law to everyday life. They believed in the continual freedom of the human will. And there was a tendency for them to look down on those who didn't follow their teachings. And we see this in the New Testament, but we see it in a variety of other places as well. Why is it then that the Pharisees were so successful? Well, they seem to have been the most influential of all the religious groups. They were powerful. They were able to engage in policy formation. The Pharisees sort of were able to form their own private eating clubs. And they had some influence. There's difference of opinion about how much, but they had some influence in terms of the government. And so the question is, how much of a line should be drawn between the Pharisees and the rabbinic literature that we know about? And the rabbinic literature can essentially be divided into two different groups. First is the Mishnah, which is an explanation of all the commandments of the Old Testament. So if you have a question about the Sabbath, you go to the Mishnah, and it tells you how to keep from breaking the Sabbath. Then there are two different Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. And they tell us how to keep from breaking the laws that are set for us in the Mishnah. So we get from this they were a very, very careful group about God's law. They didn't want to, in any sense, break the law of God. Very quickly, I'm going to give you just a couple of other groups, just so you have them in the back of your mind when we later on begin to study the New Testament. First is the Essenes. The Essenes were essentially those who produce the Qumran materials or the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are a few who argue against this, but by and large, the vast majority of scholars today will agree that it was the Essenes who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. In terms of their name, Essenes, it's essentially, the name is debated. It may mean either pious ones or the healers, depends on whom you talk to. And there were Essenes that lived in the city of Jerusalem, just as there were a certain other group who came out into the desert and wrote down the Dead Sea Scrolls, copied down the Dead Sea Scrolls. In terms of the numbers, this is debated, but there were probably around 4,000 Essenes, and there was a community near the Dead Sea where the Dead Sea Scrolls were copied, but there were communities in Jerusalem as well. And they lived this sort of simple and ascetic lifestyle. The beliefs of the Essenes is, in essence, that they did not marry. Josephus and Philo tell us that they were not the kind of, that there was no marriage among the Essenes. They were very, very harsh in terms of their legal prescriptions. If you'd like to go onto the internet and look up one of the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Rule of the 12, you will find there rules as to how one had to act during the Dead Sea Scrolls, or in the Essene community that existed, the ones that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they're very, very, very explicit. They simply will not put up with any kind of nonsense. The next group is the Zealots. In terms of the background, we have just one sort of mention of them in the New Testament, and they are known really only by their name. They may have existed during this time, but essentially what they were people who didn't believe that the Roman government had any right to control them, and they were zealous for the freedom of Israel, and they were ready to go out and kill people for it. And so there are many who will argue that what created the whole Jewish war and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD was the work of the Zealots. What we know about their belief really comes largely from the time of the revolt, which was much later than the time of Jesus. The revolt, of course, is in 70 AD. They pursued violent means to restore Jerusalem as a theocracy and not as a sort of small part of the Roman government. And they are important because of the fact that they espoused violence. They were more than willing, more than ready to go out and kill people, and more than willing and more than ready to go out and die for the freedom of Israel. This has been a quicker lesson than most. I know that many people have lots of things to do at this time of the year, and I wanted to just end up with giving you a little bit of information about these few religious groups. I hope that they've been helpful. I hope that this overview of the Old Testament has been helpful. And in the year 2021, we'll be starting with the New Testament, starting not only a new year, but a New Testament. Until that time, I hope that you have a wonderful Christmas, a great start to your new year, and that the Lord blesses you greatly as you worship with us and learn more about our Lord Jesus here at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. Merry Christmas, and may the Lord bless you greatly.